We discussed in a previous segment the absolutely horrifying arguments being made by Trump's lawyers in front of the Supreme Court. This is in favor of Trump's immunity argument, saying he really shouldn't be prosecuted for anything, but this particularly involves the election interference federal case, saying he shouldn't be prosecuted for trying to overthrow a democratic election because he is immune, because he engaged in those acts as president. And the argument being made by his lawyers is he was doing this within his official capacity as president. Interesting. And I have a moment from CNN after this where one of Trump's lawyers, Will Scarf, appeared, and his arguments were so bonkers that Caitlin Collins repeatedly had to laugh at him to his face and did a nice job of pushing back and explaining the ridiculousness of this argument. But again, as we talked about in this past segment with our legal expert, Aaron Parnas, the argument being advocated on behalf of here from Trump's lawyers is, and these are hypotheticals that were discussed in the Supreme Court, that a president could assassinate their political opponent and maybe that's an official act and they're immune from criminal prosecution, or they could orchestrate a coup and if it's an official act, maybe they're criminally immune. And same thing with, get this, orchestrating a fraudulent slate of electors scheme. That's also something John Sauer said, yep, they could be immune. So trying to escalate the presidency to something far more powerful than we should want in a democratic country. And here is Will Scarf trying to defend these arguments and Caitlin Collins nicely dismantling them and also getting a good giggle out of the absurdity.
The Supreme Court, the justices did seem, the conservative ones at least, skeptical of that. But I have to ask you about something else, because when one of the justices asked today if the president ordered a military coup, if that would be considered an official act, your team, John Sauer, argued, quote, it would depend on the circumstances whether it was an official act. What are the circumstances where ordering a military coup is an official act of the presidency?
Well, again, when you're talking about official acts, you don't look too intense.
Well, Caitlin, if there are big, massive dumps of ballots on election night,
they call them dumps, big, massive dumps,
then maybe you got to do a military coup.
An official act of the presidency.
Well, again, when you're talking about official acts, you don't look to intent and you don't look to purpose. You look to their underlying character. So if that sort of situation were to unfold using the official powers of the president, you could see there being an aspect of officialness to that. I would say, though, that our constitutional system provides powerful structural checks against exactly those sorts of scenarios, which have safeguarded our republic throughout American history. So the idea
but that's the argument people make. And also, we never had a moment where a sitting president tried to overturn a legitimate election until now.
Again, I would fight your characterization of what happened in 2020. But all of this parade of hypotheticals that some of the justices today that our opponents have put forward, whether it's the coups, whether it's SEAL Team 6 assassinating political rivals, it's worth noting that the structural checks in place in our Constitution, not including criminal prosecution of former presidents, have served to safeguard us from exactly those sorts of scenarios throughout American history. And it's actually our parade of horribles, this idea of political prosecutions crippling presidents. That's what we're seeing play out in America today.
Well, I would disagree with that characterization. I know that you refer to them as the Biden investigations. Obviously, President Biden's not involved in these. But you just said that they're hypotheticals. You know, they're actually not. Alyssa Farah Griffin, who is a comms director in the White House, tweeted this and said that there was a moment where she personally witnessed Donald Trump suggesting that whoever leaked that he went to the bunker during the George Floyd protest at the White House should be executed. So it's actually not really that far-fetched.
But they obviously weren't executed.
But does the person have to be executed for it to be brought to bear?
I think hyperbole has a place in almost any office. But I'd come back to...
You think it's just hyperbole?
I
mean, you're making a pretty brazen argument that military coups could potentially be official acts, that the person wasn't executed, so it doesn't matter.
Just because a military coup or any of these sort of parade of horribles could constitute an official act doesn't mean that they're right, doesn't mean that they would be allowed under our constitutional system, and doesn't mean that we're in any way, shape, or form justifying that. What we're talking about here, though, is the scope of immunity that presidents need to be able to rely on to discharge their core Article II responsibilities as president.
Yeah, so I think that if you believe the only way you can properly fulfill your duties as president is to have the sort of broad immunity they're talking about, even in cases of assassinating your political opponent or orchestrating a military coup, I think maybe you are going about being president incorrectly. I don't think you need that to be a good president. Maybe look into what those constitutional duties are one more time and refresh yourself, because I don't know if those are important aspects of the job. But he also mentioned the idea, and we hear this a lot from John Sauer too, of political prosecutions will cripple the presidency if you don't have this sort of broad immunity. And the argument goes something like, the second a president leaves office, he's going to be prosecuted by his political opposition, and that is only enabled by the fact that they don't have immunity. Well, obviously, they're premising that off of, in large part, their current conspiracy theories about Biden doing that to Trump, and we know those to be inaccurate. But let's even say, obviously, if a president had the type of immunity they're arguing for, then the chance would be essentially zero. They would be prosecuted after leaving office. So we can then concede that if they don't have that sort of immunity, maybe it goes slightly up, that an unjust prosecution occurs. Now, you do have safeguards in place to prevent, even though it happens, but as much as possible, prevent unjust prosecutions from going as far as a conviction. But let's even say, yes, that percentage goes slightly up if they don't have this sort of immunity. That percentage chance of an unjust prosecution occurring goes way higher when you give this sort of immunity to a sitting president. Because now the sitting president, without any fear of being held accountable legally, could assassinate their political opponent, could obviously direct an unjust prosecution of their political opponent. Who knows what else? Or if they can't get to their political opponent and the political opponent still wins, they could just call off the results of the election and orchestrate a military coup to stay in power. Or if they're not ready to go as far as that, do something like the fake elector scheme. And so it's even more likely that our political process is corrupted by unjust political prosecutions if you give the sort of power they're talking about to the sitting president, because then they could do that for their own personal ambitions. Then I mentioned the fake elector scheme. I'm happy Caitlin Collins brought that up, because the hypotheticals are really helpful in understanding how far this argument goes and understanding the bounds, right? And if you stretch this to its furthest extreme, just how crazy the argument can get. But we don't need to go to hypotheticals to understand what's being discussed here, which is they are trying to currently prevent Trump from being prosecuted for numerous things related to his attempts to block the peaceful transfer of power, but one of them being the fake elector scheme. And that's Trump assembling fraudulent electors, trying to get those accepted as the legitimate ones to justify him staying in power even though he lost the election. And if, as John Sauer said, absolutely should be the case, if the president is allowed to do that under the law and can't be prosecuted for trying to illegally block our constitutional democratic process from proceeding, then what are we having elections for? If the president can just go, yeah, I know that this whole election thing said the other guy won, but I'm going to pick my own electors and say that's the electoral college count. And look, I won. My vice president said these are the ones we should be counting, and that's what we're going to do. So I'm staying in power. And if that doesn't work, a military coup. But staying within the fake elector scheme, that's what's being discussed here. Of course, the Constitution, the founders specifically wanted to prevent one person from being able to corrupt our entire democratic process that much. That's why our elections are so federalist, right? It's so broken up state by state in how these elections are run. Each state runs their presidential election, then sends their electors to vote in the electoral college. If the president can just unilaterally choose who actually gets to count as electors, and that all falls apart. And the only way to prevent a president from doing that is for them to be abiding by the law like everybody else. And the fact that people don't understand that's crazy. By the way, friend of the show, Dave Pakman, said, it seems that based on Trump's lawyer's testimony before the Supreme Court today, if Joe Biden genuinely believes Trump to be a corrupt person and orders him assassinated as an official presidential act, he would be immune from prosecution. Wild times. That's the argument that Trump's lawyers are making. And so while Trump is running around now saying Biden should be prosecuted for illegally prosecuting Trump or something, and they're promising to lock up Biden if Trump gets another term for all the Hunter Biden conspiracy theories, then you quite literally can't make that argument that Biden should be held accountable legally for something you say he's doing if right now you're arguing the president should be above the law in this sense. And Biden could call off the election. He could do a military coup to prevent Trump from coming into office. He could assassinate his political opponent, in this case, Donald Trump. It feels uncomfortable saying that, but sticking with their argument. And he could do all these things and be criminally immune. That's the argument they're making. Crazy, crazy times. Let me know what you thought of all that in the comments.